Me and my son came out here to have some father-son moments, but this guy decided to be racist.
Sir, I need you to
Take your hands off me.
Whoa, what's going on?
You see this? We were just getting ice cream. He walked up and started questioning us like we don't belong here.
Sir, lower your voice.
I don't have to give you nothing.
Now picture this. A warm, sunny afternoon in downtown Chicago. A black man and his 8-year-old white son walking hand in hand toward their favorite ice cream shop. Just a normal day, right? But within minutes, flashing blue lights paint the street. A police car pulls up. An officer steps out, his hand already resting on his belt. What happens next turns into a nightmare. One that would expose the ugly truth about racial profiling in America. And the most shocking part? The man being profiled wasn't a criminal. He was a federal agent who had spent years protecting this very country. Before we dive deeper into this unbelievable story, where are you watching from? If you're new here, please hit that subscribe button because stories like this need to be told. Your support helps bring real cases like this into the light. Antonio had served in the IRS Criminal Investigation Division for over 12 years. Now, if you think IRS agents are just number nerds pushing paper, think again. These are armed federal agents who hunt down financial criminals, money launderers, tax evaders, and drug lords. They work side by side with the FBI, DEA, and Secret Service. Antonio wasn't just good at his job. He was exceptional. He'd put dangerous people behind bars, broken up massive fraud rings, and built a career out of fighting crime. But this story isn't about Antonio's career. It's about one Saturday afternoon in June 2023 when everything he'd achieved meant absolutely nothing to one officer named Parker. 2 years earlier, in 2021, Antonio had helped crack a massive financial fraud case. It was one of those investigations that changed lives, and not always for the better. The operation exposed a criminal network that had ruined dozens of families financially. When the dust settled and the guilty were sentenced, there was one heartbreaking detail left behind. A 6-year-old boy named Tommy. Both of his parents were arrested. No family wanted him. No one stepped up. Antonio remembered seeing the child during the case, quiet, confused, alone. Something inside him couldn't let go. Maybe it was because Antonio had grown up in foster care himself. Maybe it was guilt. Or maybe it was compassion, the kind that doesn't fade when the paperwork ends. He went through all the channels, background checks, interviews, foster care training. And eventually, he welcomed Tommy into his home. By 2023, the adoption was nearly finalized. Tommy didn't call him Mr. Antonio anymore. He called him Dad. Saturdays became their special time. Ice cream, laughter, and long walks through the city. Tommy was thriving. He had friends, he played baseball, and his smile could light up a room. Antonio had rearranged his entire life for this kid. Fewer field cases, more time at home, always dinner together. He'd finally found balance, until that day. That Saturday, they had just come from a sporting goods store. Tommy had a baseball game coming up and needed new cleats. They walked down Michigan Avenue, one of Chicago's busiest streets, alive with weekend chatter and traffic. Tommy was talking nonstop, full of excitement about playing shortstop for the first time. Antonio listened, smiling, holding his son's hand. Everything felt perfect. And then a police siren. A patrol car slowed down beside them. Behind the wheel, Officer Parker. Parker had been with the department for 6 years. He had a reputation, a short temper, a gut feeling about people, which was just another way of saying bias. He'd received multiple complaints for aggressive behavior, but never faced real consequences. When Parker's eyes landed on Antonio, a black man in casual clothes, walking hand in hand with a white child, something ugly stirred in his mind. He didn't see love. He didn't see family. He saw something that didn't fit. He pulled over. No call, no complaint, no reason. just prejudice on instinct. Antonio noticed him approaching, but didn't think much of it. Police walk these streets all the time. But then, Parker stepped directly into their path, blocking the sidewalk. Antonio's stomach dropped. He'd heard the stories. He'd seen the statistics. But never, not once, did he imagine it would happen to him, a man who'd served the law for over a decade. Parker's first words were direct. No greeting. No explanation. Just pure suspicion. "Hey, excuse me, sir, is everything okay here?" Antonio blinked, confused. Yeah, officer. Just getting ice cream with my son." He smiled politely, trying to keep things calm. But Parker's expression hardened. "Your son?" he repeated, eyes narrowing. "How old are you, kid?" Tommy froze, gripping Antonio's hand tighter. "I'm 8, he whispered. Parker crouched down, forcing a fake smile. "Everything all right, buddy? You with this man willingly?" That word, willingly, hit Antonio like a slap. His chest tightened. He could feel people starting to stare. "Officer," Antonio said, keeping his voice even, "I don't appreciate what you're implying." Parker stood up straight, hand now resting near his holster. "I'm not implying anything, sir. Just doing my job. You mind showing me some ID?" At that moment, Antonio had two choices. He could lose his temper, or he could remind himself of the badge he carried. He reached slowly for his wallet. "Of course," he said, pulling out his federal ID. "Special Agent Antonio Williams, IRS Criminal Investigation Division." He held the badge steady. Parker didn't even glance at it. "IRS." Parker scoffed. "That's cute. Doesn't change the fact that something doesn't add up here." By now, a few bystanders had stopped to watch. Some were recording. A mother pulled her child a little closer as she passed. Tommy looked up at his father, his eyes wide and scared. "Dad, did I do something wrong?" That question, so innocent, so painful, broke Antonio's heart. He crouched down, putting a hand on Tommy's shoulder. "No, son, you didn't do anything wrong. Everything's fine." But inside he was shaking. Not from fear, from fury. Parker radioed something in. Antonio couldn't hear all the words, but he caught enough. Possible abduction, adult black male, white juvenile. That was it. The humiliation hit like a wave. He wasn't just being questioned. He was being profiled in front of his son. Antonio stood tall now, his tone sharp but controlled. "Officer Parker, you're making a serious mistake. I've identified myself as a federal agent. You're detaining me in public without cause, in front of my child." Parker smirked. "Then you won't mind waiting till we confirm that badge is real." He motioned to his partner, who had just arrived, a young officer named Daniels. Unlike Parker, Daniels looked uncomfortable. He hesitated. Sir, maybe we should just..." Parker cut him off. "Daniels, run the ID. Now." Antonio exhaled slowly, trying to stay calm. His hands were trembling, not from fear, but from restraint. He knew one wrong move, one wrong tone, and this could spiral out of control. So he pulled out his phone and started recording. "Officer Parker," he said, voice steady but cold, "for my own safety, I'm recording this encounter." Parker's face darkened. "You're not allowed to film me." "Yes, I am," Antonio replied. "This is a public space. And for the record, you're harassing a federal agent and a minor without probable cause." Tommy clung to his father's leg, whispering, "Dad, please, can we go?" Antonio bent down, forcing a smile for his son's sake. "It's okay, buddy. It'll be over soon." But in his mind, something snapped. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every father, every black man who had ever been judged not by his actions, but by his skin. Within minutes, 2 more patrol cars arrived. Sirens, flashing lights, cameras, the entire street watching. And, standing in the middle of it all, was a man who'd spent his life serving the law, now treated like a criminal by it. Antonio's heart pounded as he thought, if this is how they treat someone with a badge, what hope does anyone else have? Finally, one of the new officers, Sergeant Miller, approached Parker. He took one look at Antonio's credentials and immediately frowned. "Parker," he said quietly, "stand down." "He's legit." Parker's jaw tightened. "You sure?" "Yes." "Special Agent Williams. IRS-CI. Been with the feds for over a decade. You just profiled a federal officer in broad daylight." The crowd began murmuring. Phones were still recording. Parker's face turned red. Antonio looked him straight in the eye. "I told you who I was, but you saw what you wanted to see." Parker didn't respond. He just turned away, muttering something under his breath. Sergeant Miller apologized. "I'm so sorry, Agent Williams. This should have never happened." Antonio nodded, but his voice cracked when he said, "Try explaining that to my son." When Parker walked back to his cruiser, people started clapping. Not for him, but for Antonio. The truth was clear. One man's prejudice had tried to destroy a father's dignity. But the truth and the camera protected him. That night, Antonio tucked Tommy into bed. The boy was quiet. Then he asked softly, "Dad, why did that man think you stole me?" Antonio took a deep breath. He didn't have an easy answer. So he said the only thing he could. Because sometimes people don't see what's real. They just see what they want to see. That night, Antonio barely slept. The street was quiet, but his mind wouldn't stop replaying those flashing lights. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Parker's face, the disbelief, the arrogance, the way he'd looked at him like he didn't belong. Across the hall, Tommy had cried himself to sleep. Antonio stood at the door for a long time, watching his son's small hand resting on the blanket, and whispered, "I'm sorry, buddy, you didn't deserve to see that." By morning, everything had changed. The video someone had recorded, the whole humiliating scene, was everywhere. Twitter, TikTok, news channels, millions of views overnight. People couldn't believe what they were watching. A decorated federal agent being profiled in front of his child. Headlines exploded. Black federal agent wrongfully detained. Officer questions father for being too dark. Antonio's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Reporters, friends, colleagues. Even his director at the IRS called him personally. "Antonio, you okay? We're handling this." But Antonio didn't want interviews or sympathy. He wanted something no headline could give him. Dignity, peace, and answers for his son. Meanwhile, the Chicago Police Department was under fire. Protesters gathered outside the precinct. Hashtag Justice for Antonio trended for days. City officials promised an internal review. But for Antonio, the damage was already done. He'd spent his entire career believing that wearing a badge meant something, that it protected him. But that day proved otherwise. When the department finally reached out, they asked if he'd accept an official apology. He said, "An apology won't erase what my son saw." A week later, Antonio decided to speak publicly. Not out of anger, but out of love. He stood before a small crowd at a community center, microphones in front of him, Tommy sitting in the front row. His voice shook at first, but every word carried the weight of truth. "I've spent years serving this country," he began softly. "I've arrested criminals, I've carried a gun, I've protected people who'll never even know my name. But last week, none of that mattered because of the color of my skin." The crowd went silent. When my son asked me why that officer thought I stole him, I didn't have an answer. How do you explain hate to a child? How do you teach him to trust a system that just broke his trust? He paused, glancing at Tommy. "But here's what I told him. You don't stop believing in good just because someone showed you evil. You stand taller. You stay kinder. Because love will always be louder than hate." By the time he finished, people were crying. Even the reporters lowered their cameras for a moment. Tommy ran up to the stage, and hugged him tight. And in that embrace, Antonio finally felt the weight lift, not gone but lighter. Days later, Officer Parker was suspended pending investigation. He issued a statement of regret, but it sounded hollow. The world had already made up its mind. Racism had been caught red-handed, and no PR line could clean that up. Antonio didn't celebrate his downfall. He didn't want revenge. He just wanted change. That's why, a month later, he started a small foundation called See the Truth, an awareness program that trained police departments on bias and empathy. He used his own story as the first lesson. When asked in an interview what kept him going after everything, Antonio smiled faintly and said, "My son, because every time he looks at me, I remember what I'm fighting for." A few months later, it was a cool autumn evening. Golden leaves floated down the sidewalks as Antonio and Tommy walked home from the park. This time, there were no flashing lights, no stairs, just laughter echoing between them. Light, real, healing. Tommy skipped ahead, holding a small cone of chocolate ice cream. "Hey, Dad," he said, looking up. "Remember that day when that man stopped us?" Antonio's smile faded for a second, but then he nodded gently. "I remember, son." Tommy paused. "I was scared that day, but I'm not scared anymore." Antonio stopped walking. He looked at his boy, his son, and felt his eyes sting. "Why's that, buddy?" Tommy shrugged. "Because you told me good people don't stop being good. And you didn't stop." Antonio knelt down, his voice barely above a whisper. "You listen to that?" Tommy grinned. "Yeah, and I think you're one of the good ones." That moment, that one small sentence was worth more than any medal Antonio had ever received. He hugged Tommy tight, breathing in the scent of his son's hair, feeling the warmth that hate could never take away. Later that night, Antonio sat by his window, city lights glowing outside. He thought about everything that had happened, the humiliation, the anger, the fear, but also the unity it sparked. He remembered the thousands of strangers who had sent messages of love, support, and prayers. He realized something powerful. For every person filled with hate, there are 100 filled with hope. And that's what keeps the world moving forward. He whispered softly, almost like a prayer. Justice doesn't always start in a courtroom. Sometimes it starts with a child who believes in kindness. The next morning, Antonio took Tommy to his foundation's small office. On the wall hung a framed photo of them both, smiling, holding hands, under a quote that read, "Don't judge what you don't understand." It became the symbol of their journey, not of pain, but of purpose. And as Antonio stood there, watching his son doodle on a whiteboard, he realized, maybe the world doesn't change overnight, but it changes one heart at a time. And sometimes all it takes is the courage to stay kind when the world isn't. Antonio's story reminds us that love doesn't see color. It sees character. And no badge, no title, no uniform should ever make one human feel smaller than another. If this story touched your heart, share it, because every share spreads the light a little further.